The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Millbrook, Texas, as Elena Martinez swept the front porch of the general store for the third time that week. Her movements were precise, methodical, each stroke of the broom calculated to avoid drawing attention to herself. At 24, she had perfected the art of invisibility, a skill taught to her by necessity and reinforced by years of careful conditioning. "Elena, make sure you get those corners," called Mrs. Patterson from inside the store, her voice carrying the familiar tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The mayor's wife might stop by today, and you know how particular she is about cleanliness." "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned long ago that speaking too loudly, too confidently, or too frequently brought unwanted consequences. In Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, being the daughter of undocumented immigrants meant living in the spaces between visibility and complete erasure. Elena's father, Miguel, had crossed the border 25 years ago with nothing but hope and calloused hands willing to work. Her mother, Carmen, had followed 2 years later, carrying Elena as a baby. They had built a life in the shadows of this Texas town, where Miguel's skill as a mechanic had earned him steady work, even if it came without benefits, job security, or the luxury of speaking up when payments were late. The general store where Elena worked belonged to the Patterson family, who had owned it for 3 generations. Mrs. Patterson wasn't cruel exactly, but she carried herself with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned her place in the world's hierarchy. Eleanor was grateful for the job, even if it meant enduring the constant reminders of her position through subtle gestures and carefully chosen words. As Elena finished sweeping, she noticed a black and white patrol car pulling up to the curb. Her stomach tightened instinctively, a conditioned response developed over years of watching her parents tense whenever law enforcement appeared. She kept her head down, focusing on the broom in her hands, hoping to remain unnoticed. Sheriff James Mitchell stepped out of the vehicle, his boots clicking against the pavement as he approached the store. At 38, he was relatively young for his position, having been elected 2 years prior on a platform of community policing and fair treatment for all residents. He was tall, with graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that commanded respect without demanding it. Eleanor had seen the sheriff around town countless times, but had never spoken to him directly. In her world, interactions with law enforcement were to be avoided at all costs. Her parents had drilled this into her from childhood. Keep your head down. Don't make trouble. Don't give anyone a reason to look too closely at your family's situation. "Morning, Elena," Sheriff Mitchell said as he reached the porch steps. The sound of her name on his lips startled her. She looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for just a moment before quickly averting her gaze. "Good morning, Sheriff," she murmured, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. There was something in his expression, a gentleness that caught her off guard. Most authority figures in town either ignored her completely or addressed her with the kind of casual dismissiveness reserved for people they considered beneath notice. But Sheriff Mitchell's acknowledgement felt different, more human somehow. "Is Mrs. Patterson in?" he asked, his tone conversational rather than official. "Yes, sir. She's inside." Elena stepped aside, pressing herself against the wall to give him plenty of room to pass. It was a practiced movement, designed to make herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. Sheriff Mitchell paused at the door, glancing back at her. "That's some fine work you're doing out here," he said, gesturing to the spotless porch. "The town's lucky to have someone who takes such pride in keeping things looking good." Eleanor blinked in surprise. In her entire life, she couldn't remember a single instance of someone in authority complimenting her work. The words settled over her like sunlight breaking through clouds, warming something inside her that she hadn't realized was cold. "Thank you, sir," she managed, still not quite believing what she had heard. As Sheriff Mitchell disappeared into the store, Elena remained on the porch, replaying the brief interaction in her mind. There had been something in his demeanor, a respect that felt foreign, yet deeply welcome. She had grown up believing that people like her were meant to be background figures, present but not acknowledged, useful but not valued. Inside the store, she could hear Sheriff Mitchell talking with Mrs. Patterson about the upcoming county fair, their voices carrying the easy familiarity of people who belonged to the same social circle. Elena resumed her sweeping, but her mind wandered to the way he had looked at her when he spoke, not through her or around her, but directly at her, as if she were a person worthy of being seen. The rest of the morning passed in its usual rhythm. Elena restocked shelves, helped customers find items, and handled the cash register when Mrs. Patterson stepped out for her weekly coffee with the other business owners. Each task was performed with the same careful attention to detail that had kept her employed for the past 6 years, ever since she had graduated from high school and decided against pursuing college. Her parents needed the income, and besides, she had reasoned college was for people with documentation, with certainty about their futures. Around noon, Eleanor was organizing the canned goods when she heard raised voices from the street. Through the store window, she could see a small crowd gathering around a familiar figure, her father, Miguel, standing next to his beat-up pickup truck with the hood raised. Steam was pouring from the engine, and even from a distance, she could see the frustration and embarrassment on his weathered face. "Should have known better than to trust that old piece of junk," someone in the crowd was saying, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably held together with duct tape and prayers." Eleanor's hands clenched around the can she was holding. Her father was a skilled mechanic, but he drove an old truck because it was what he could afford, not because he didn't know how to maintain vehicles. The casual cruelty in the comment made her chest tight with anger and helplessness. "Elena, what's all that commotion?" Mrs. Patterson asked, emerging from the back room. "My father's truck broke down," Elena said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the scene outside. Mrs. Patterson clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Well, he'll just have to deal with it. We can't have you running off during work hours for family emergencies." Elena nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to go help her father. She had been raised to prioritize others' expectations over her own family's needs, a lesson reinforced by years of precarious employment and the constant fear of losing what little stability they had managed to build. Just then, Sheriff Mitchell's patrol car pulled up to the scene. Elena watched as he got out and approached her father, but instead of the confrontational stance she expected, the sheriff's body language was relaxed, helpful. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw her father's shoulders relax slightly as Sheriff Mitchell popped the hood of his own vehicle and retrieved a set of jumper cables. For the next 20 minutes, Elena watched through the window as Sheriff Mitchell helped her father diagnose and temporarily fix the truck's problem. They worked together, two men focused on a common goal, and Elena was struck by how the sheriff treated her father, not as a nuisance or a problem to be solved, but as a fellow human being deserving of assistance. When the truck finally started, Elena saw her father extend his hand to Sheriff Mitchell. The handshake that followed looked firm, genuine, filled with the kind of mutual respect that Elena had rarely seen her father receive from other authority figures in town. "Looks like your father got some help," Mrs. Patterson observed, having noticed Elena's distraction. "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied, but her mind was elsewhere, processing what she had just witnessed. Sheriff Mitchell could have easily driven past the scene, could have treated it as someone else's problem. Instead, he had stopped, rolled up his sleeves, and offered practical help without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. As the crowd dispersed and her father drove away, Elena found herself thinking about the sheriff's earlier words on the porch. The compliment about her work had seemed genuine, not the kind of empty politeness that people sometimes offered when they wanted something. And now, seeing how he had treated her father, she began to wonder if Sheriff Mitchell might be different from the other authority figures who had shaped her understanding of her place in the world. The afternoon wore on, and Elena continued her work with the same quiet efficiency that had become second nature. But something had shifted inside her, a small crack in the wall of assumptions she had built around herself and her family's position in Millbrook. For the first time in years, she found herself curious about what it might feel like to be seen, really seen as someone with value beyond her ability to remain invisible and compliant. As closing time approached, Elena was tallying the day's receipts when she heard the familiar sound of Sheriff Mitchell's boots on the porch steps. Mrs. Patterson had left early for a doctor's appointment, leaving Eleanor to close the store alone, a responsibility that still felt significant after all these years. "Evening, Eleanor," Sheriff Mitchell said as he entered, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy that surprised her. "Good evening, Sheriff," she replied, her voice still soft but carrying a note of something that hadn't been there that morning, perhaps the smallest hint of confidence. "I wanted to stop by and let you know your father's truck should hold up fine until he can get it properly looked at," he said, approaching the counter where she stood. "He's a good man, your father. Knows his way around an engine." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at the genuine respect in his voice when he spoke about Miguel. "Thank you for helping him today," she said, the words coming easier than she expected. It meant a lot. Sheriff Mitchell studied her face for a moment, and Elena realized she was meeting his gaze more directly than she ever had before. "Family's important," he said simply. "Sometimes we all need a little help." As he turned to leave, Sheriff Mitchell paused at the door. "Elena," he said, and something in his tone made her look up expectantly. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After he left, Elena stood in the empty store, surrounded by the familiar scents of floor wax and packaged goods, but feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. For 24 years, she had been taught that her role was to bow her head, speak only when spoken to, and never draw attention to herself. But today, for the first time, someone had seen her, really seen her, and suggested that she might be worth more than her silence. As she locked up the store and began the walk home to the small house she shared with her parents, Eleanor found herself thinking about tomorrow, wondering what other possibilities might exist beyond the careful boundaries she had spent her lifetime learning to navigate. The next morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt, turning Millbrook's main street into a hazy mirage. Eleanor arrived at the general store 30 minutes early, as she always did, using the quiet time before Mrs. Patterson's arrival to organize inventory and prepare for the day ahead. But today felt different. The memory of Sheriff Mitchell's words from the previous evening lingered in her mind like the echo of a song she couldn't quite forget. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She had replayed those words countless times during the restless night, turning them over like smooth stones in her palm, examining them from every angle. In her 24 years, no one in a position of authority had ever suggested she possessed intelligence worth acknowledging, let alone worth protecting. Elena was arranging the morning newspapers when she noticed an unfamiliar black sedan parked across the street. 3 men in suits stood beside it, their posture rigid and official in a way that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents had visited Millbrook before, usually conducting raids at the meatpacking plant on the outskirts of town or making surprise inspections at construction sites. The sight of them always sent ripples of fear through the immigrant community, a reminder that their presence in this country remained perpetually uncertain. The bell above the store's entrance chimed, and Mrs. Patterson entered with her usual brisk efficiency, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and the morning's gossip gathered from her walk down Main Street. "Elena, I hope you've got everything ready," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Word is there are federal agents in town asking questions. The last thing we need is any kind of disruption to business." Elena's hands stilled on the newspaper she was stacking. "Yes, ma'am. Everything's ready." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a moment, and Elena could see the calculation in her employer's eyes. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "Are you going to be a problem today?" Elena had learned to read these subtle evaluations, the way people assessed whether associating with her family might bring unwanted scrutiny. "Good," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "Let's hope it stays that way." The morning progressed with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to affect everyone who entered the store. Customers spoke in lower voices, their conversations peppered with worried speculation about why federal agents had come to their quiet town. Elena moved through her tasks with extra care, hyper-aware of every movement, every word, every potential reason someone might notice her. Around 10 o'clock, the bell chimed again, and Eleanor looked up to see Sheriff Mitchell entering the store. Today, his usual calm demeanor carried an edge of purpose that immediately caught her attention. He nodded to Mrs. Patterson, who was helping another customer, then approached the counter where Eleanor stood organizing receipts. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone that had surprised her the day before. "Good morning, Sheriff," she replied, her eyes automatically scanning the store to see if anyone was watching their interaction. Sheriff Mitchell seemed to notice her nervousness. He leaned slightly closer to the counter, lowering his voice. "I wanted to let you know that if anyone, and I mean anyone, comes by asking questions about you or your family, you don't have to answer them without a lawyer present. That's your right, regardless of your situation." Elena's breath caught in her throat. The sheriff's words were careful, coded, but their meaning was unmistakably clear. He knew about her family's status, and he was offering protection rather than persecution. The kindness in the gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been taught to expect from law enforcement, that she found herself speechless. She began, then stopped, unsure how to respond to such unprecedented support. "You don't need to say anything," Sheriff Mitchell continued, his eyes kind but serious. "Just remember what I told you, and if you need help, any kind of help, you know where to find me." Before Elena could formulate a response, The store's bell chimed with unusual force, and one of the suited men from across the street entered. He was tall and thin, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors, and his eyes moved across the store's interior with mechanical precision, cataloging details. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of federal bureaucracy. "I'm Agent Carson with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I'm conducting routine inquiries in the area." Eleanor felt her body go rigid, every muscle tensing as if preparing for flight. Her hands, which had been steady moments before, began to tremble slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. This was the moment she had been dreading her entire life, direct confrontation with the system that could tear her family apart with a few phone calls and some paperwork. "Mrs. Patterson emerged from behind a display rack, her expression shifting into the practiced politeness reserved for dealing with authority figures. "Of course, Agent Carson. How can we help you?" Agent Carson's gaze swept over Eleanor briefly before settling on Mrs. Patterson. "I'm looking for information about individuals who might be working in the area without proper documentation. Specifically, I'm interested in anyone who might have connections to the Martinez family." The sound of her family name spoken aloud by a federal agent made Elena's vision blur slightly around the edges. She gripped the counter harder, fighting the urge to run, to disappear, to somehow become invisible in a way that would make this entire situation go away. "I'm afraid I can't help you with that," Sheriff Mitchell said, his voice cutting through the tension with unexpected authority. Eleanor had been so focused on Agent Carson that she hadn't noticed the sheriff moving closer to where she stood. Agent Carson turned his attention to Sheriff Mitchell, his expression shifting into something more guarded. "Sheriff, I wasn't aware local law enforcement was involved in this inquiry." "I'm not involved in your inquiry," Sheriff Mitchell replied, his tone remaining professional but carrying an unmistakable edge. "But I am responsible for ensuring that all residents of Millbrook are treated fairly and that their constitutional rights are respected." The two men regarded each other with the kind of careful tension that suggested competing jurisdictions and conflicting priorities. Elena found herself caught between them, acutely aware that her fate might be determined by this bureaucratic standoff. "The individuals I'm seeking information about may be in violation of federal immigration law," Agent Carson said, his voice taking on a harder quality. "I'm sure you understand the importance of federal cooperation in these matters." "I understand the importance of due process," Sheriff Mitchell replied evenly, "and I also understand that residents of my county have rights, regardless of their documentation status. If you have specific charges or warrants, I'm happy to discuss proper procedures. Otherwise, I suggest you conduct your inquiries through appropriate legal channels." Elena watched this exchange with amazement and growing hope. Sheriff Mitchell wasn't just refusing to cooperate with Agent Carson, he was actively protecting her and her family, using his authority as a shield rather than a weapon. The realization that someone in power was willing to stand between her family and potential persecution was so foreign to her experience that it felt almost surreal. Agent Carson's jaw tightened, but he seemed to recognize that pushing the issue further would likely prove counterproductive. "I see. Well, Sheriff, I hope you understand that federal law supersedes local preferences. And I hope you understand that constitutional rights apply to everyone within our borders," Sheriff Mitchell replied. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." After Agent Carson left, the store fell into an uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Patterson busied herself with unnecessary tasks, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation she had just witnessed. Eleanor remained frozen at the counter, processing what had just occurred. Sheriff Mitchell approached her again, his expression gentle but serious. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. Helena nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than any she had ever spoken. "You don't need to thank me for doing my job," he replied, "but I want you to remember what happened here today. Sometimes standing up for what's right means standing up to people who think their authority gives them the right to intimidate others." As Sheriff Mitchell prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at Eleanor. "I meant what I said yesterday about having a good head on your shoulders. Don't let anyone make you feel small because of circumstances beyond your control." After he left, Elena found herself replaying the entire encounter, marveling at how Sheriff Mitchell had transformed a terrifying situation into something resembling safety. For the first time in her life, she had witnessed someone use their power to protect rather than persecute, to shield rather than expose. The rest of the day passed quietly, but Eleanor carried herself differently. The knowledge that Sheriff Mitchell had been willing to stand up for her family, even at potential professional cost, had planted something new in her chest, a small but growing sense that maybe, just maybe, she was worth defending. That evening, as she walked home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, Eleanor found herself thinking about courage. She had always assumed that brave people were born different, naturally confident and unafraid. But watching Sheriff Mitchell that afternoon, she had seen something else. Courage as a choice, bravery as a deliberate act of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to be that kind of brave. To speak up, rather than stay silent. To stand tall, rather than bow her head. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and considering whether to jump. As she reached her family's small house, Eleanor could hear her parents' voices from the kitchen, speaking in rapid Spanish about the day's events. Word of the federal agents had spread quickly through the immigrant community, as it always did, carried by a network of whispered warnings and shared fears. But tonight, Elena had something different to share, a story of protection rather than persecution, of an authority figure who had chosen to serve rather than intimidate. As she pushed open the front door, she realized that Sheriff Mitchell's belief in her worth was beginning to teach her something she had never learned before: how to believe in herself. 2 weeks had passed since the encounter with Agent Carson, and Elena noticed subtle changes in how she moved through the world. Her shoulders didn't automatically hunch when she heard approaching footsteps, and she found herself making eye contact more frequently during conversations, though the habit of deference still ran deep in her bones. The morning started like any other, with Elena arriving early at the general store to prepare for the day. But as she unlocked the front door, she discovered an envelope that had been slipped underneath during the night. Her name was written across the front in careful handwriting, and her heart rate quickened as she recognized the formal appearance of official correspondence. Inside the envelope was a letter from the Millbrook County Adult Education Center, informing her that someone had submitted an application on her behalf for their evening GED completion program. The letter explained that while she had graduated high school, the program also offered college preparatory courses and vocational training that might help advance her career prospects. Elena read the letter 3 times, confusion mixing with a flutter of something that might have been hope. She had never submitted such an application, had never even considered the possibility that additional education might be within her reach. College and advanced training were luxuries for people with stable futures and clear documentation, not for someone who lived in the shadows of legal uncertainty. "Elena, what's that you're reading?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried its usual note of suspicion as she entered the store, eyeing the official-looking letterhead. It's about some adult education classes," Eleanor said, folding the letter carefully and tucking it into her apron pocket. "Someone sent me information by mistake." Mrs. Patterson's expression sharpened. "I hope you're not getting ideas about changing your situation here. This job requires reliability, and I can't have employees running off to chase unrealistic dreams." "No, ma'am," Elena replied automatically, though something inside her bristled at the casual dismissal of her potential. "I wouldn't do anything to jeopardize my position." But as the morning progressed, Elena found her thoughts returning to the letter. Someone had believed she was capable of more than stocking shelves and operating a cash register. Someone had seen enough potential in her to take the initiative of submitting an application. The question that nagged at her was, who? Her answer came during the lunch rush, when Sheriff Mitchell entered the store to purchase a sandwich and a cold drink. As he approached the counter, Eleanor noticed him glance meaningfully at her apron pocket where the letter was hidden. "Afternoon, Elena," he said, his tone carrying the same respectful warmth that had become familiar over the past weeks. "How are you doing today?" "Fine, thank you, Sheriff," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "I received some interesting mail this morning." Sheriff Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor caught a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Is that so? I hope it was good news." Eleanor glanced around the store to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned slightly closer to the counter. "Did you—" she began, then stopped, unsure how to ask the question directly. "Did I what?" he asked gently, though his eyes suggested he knew exactly what she was trying to ask. "The adult education program," Elena said quietly. "Someone submitted an application for me." Sheriff Mitchell paid for his items, taking his time counting out the exact change. "You know, Elena, sometimes opportunities present themselves when we least expect them. The question isn't always where they come from, but what we choose to do with them." Eleanor studied his face, reading the careful way he had answered without directly admitting to anything. The realization that he had taken such a personal interest in her future was both overwhelming and deeply moving. No one had ever invested in her potential before, and the gesture felt more valuable than any gift she had ever received. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," she admitted, voicing the fear that had been growing since she first read the letter. Sheriff Mitchell set his purchases on the counter and looked directly into her eyes. "Elena, I've watched you handle this store, deal with difficult customers, manage inventory, and solve problems that would stump people with college degrees. You're more ready than you think. But what if I fail?" The question escaped before she could stop it, revealing the deep-seated insecurity that had shaped so many of her life decisions. "What if you succeed?" he countered gently. "What if you discover that you're capable of things you never imagined? Isn't that possibility worth exploring?" Before Elena could respond, the store's bell chimed aggressively, and Agent Carson entered for the second time in 2 weeks. This time he wasn't alone. A local man Elena recognized as Danny Morrison accompanied him. Danny worked occasional construction jobs and had a reputation for drinking too much and causing trouble when he needed money. "Afternoon," Agent Carson said, his tone carrying the same bureaucratic authority as before. "I'm following up on some information I received about individuals working in this area without proper documentation." Eleanor felt her stomach drop as Danny Morrison stepped forward, avoiding eye contact with her. "That's her," he said, pointing directly at Elena. "Elena Martinez. Her whole family's been living here illegally for years. Everyone knows it, but nobody wants to say anything." The accusation hung in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on Elena's chest and making it difficult to breathe. She had always known this moment might come, but experiencing it felt surreal, like watching someone else's nightmare unfold. Sheriff Mitchell stepped closer to the counter, positioning himself slightly between Eleanor and the two men. "Danny, I'm surprised to see you cooperating with federal agents. Last I checked, you had your own legal issues to worry about." Danny's face flushed red. "My problems don't have nothing to do with this. I'm just being a good citizen reporting what I know." "And what exactly do you know?" Sheriff Mitchell asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made Elena's skin prickle with recognition. She had heard him use this tone with Agent Carson before, the voice of someone who was done being polite. "I know she's illegal," Danny said, his confidence wavering slightly under Sheriff Mitchell's steady gaze. "Her whole family came over without papers." Agent Carson pulled out a small notebook, his pen poised to record information. "Can you provide specific details about their immigration status, documents you've seen, conversations you've overheard?" Danny shifted uncomfortably, realizing that making vague accusations was different from providing concrete evidence. "Well, everyone just knows, you know. It's common knowledge around town." "Common knowledge isn't evidence," Sheriff Mitchell said firmly. "And last I checked, we don't arrest people based on neighborhood gossip and personal prejudices." Elena watched this exchange with a mixture of terror and amazement. Once again, Sheriff Mitchell was using his authority to protect her, but this time the stakes felt higher, more personal. Danny Morrison's accusation had made her vulnerability public in a way that felt irreversible. Agent Carson studied Elena with calculating eyes. "Miss Martinez, I'd like to ask you some questions about your immigration status and that of your family members." Elena felt Sheriff Mitchell's presence beside her like an anchor in a storm. His earlier words echoed in her mind. "You don't have to answer them without a lawyer present. That's your right, regardless of your situation." For the first time in her life, Elena lifted her chin and met Agent Carson's gaze directly. "I have the right to remain silent," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I have the right to an attorney. I don't wish to answer any questions without legal representation present." The words felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she had only recently learned, but they carried a power that surprised her. She was claiming space for herself, asserting rights she had never believed she possessed. Agent Carson's expression darkened. "Miss Martinez, cooperation would be in your best interest. Refusing to answer questions might suggest you have something to hide." "Refusing to answer questions suggests she understands her constitutional rights," Sheriff Mitchell interjected, "and I'd say that shows pretty good judgment." Danny Morrison looked between the two authority figures, seeming to realize that his attempt to create trouble had backfired. "Look, I was just trying to help," he mumbled, backing toward the door. "Help?" Sheriff Mitchell's voice carried a note of disgust. "You came in here to intimidate a young woman who's never done anything to you. If that's your idea of helping, I suggest you reconsider your priorities." After Agent Carson and Danny left, Elena remained behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline that was slowly subsiding. Mrs. Patterson had witnessed the entire exchange from behind a display rack, and her expression suggested that Elena's employment situation had just become significantly more complicated. Sheriff Mitchell approached the counter again, his expression gentle but serious. "Are you okay?" Elena nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of everything he had done for her family over the past weeks. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "what happened here today is going to make things more difficult for you. Agent Carson isn't going to give up easily, and there will be people in town who side with Danny Morrison's way of thinking." Elena felt a chill of fear, but underneath it was something else, a spark of the courage she had seen Sheriff Mitchell demonstrate repeatedly. "What should I do?" "You should consider that adult education program," he said firmly. "You should invest in yourself and your future, and you should remember that you have just as much right to be here, to build a life, to pursue your dreams as anyone else in this town." Eleanor pulled the letter from her pocket, looking at it with new eyes. What had seemed impossible that morning now felt like a lifeline, a path towards something better than simply surviving day to day. "The classes start next month," she said, more to herself than to Sheriff Mitchell. "That gives you time to prepare," he replied. "And Elena, what you did just now, standing up for yourself, asserting your rights, that took real courage. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not brave enough for whatever comes next." As Sheriff Mitchell left the store, Elena held the letter against her chest, feeling the weight of possibility and fear in equal measure. For the first time in her life, she was considering the radical notion that she might be worth fighting for, not just by others, but by herself. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected chill to Millbrook, with grey clouds gathering overhead like a warning of storms to come. Elena arrived at the general store to find Mrs. Patterson waiting by the front door, her expression more severe than usual. A folded newspaper was clutched in her hands, and Elena could see her own name in bold letters across the front page of the Millbrook County Gazette. "We need to talk," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble, unlocking the store and gesturing for Elena to follow her inside. The newspaper's headline read, "Local business employs undocumented worker despite federal investigation." The article, written by the paper's editor Harold Brennan, detailed Danny Morrison's accusations and Agent Carson's ongoing investigation. Elena's photograph from her high school yearbook had been included, making her face recognizable to anyone who might not have known her personally. Elena's hands trembled as she read the article, which painted her as a symbol of illegal immigration, rather than as a person with a name, a family, and a life built over more than 2 decades in this community. The piece included quotes from anonymous sources expressing concern about law-breaking individuals taking jobs from legal residents, and speculation about her family's true immigration status. "Elena," Mrs. Patterson began, her voice carrying the weight of a decision already made, "you know I've always been fair to you and your family. I've given you steady work for 6 years, and I've never asked questions I didn't need to ask." Elena nodded, though she could feel where this conversation was heading, like a train approaching from a distance. "But this situation has become bigger than just you and me," Mrs. Patterson continued. "I've got other employees to think about, and I can't have federal agents coming into my store, disrupting business, scaring away customers. The mayor's wife called me this morning, and 3 different suppliers have already expressed concerns about continuing to work with us." "Mrs. Patterson, please," Eleanor said, finding her voice despite the fear that was making her throat tight. "I've never missed a day of work. I've never caused any problems. This isn't my fault." "I know it's not your fault," Mrs. Patterson replied, though her tone suggested this distinction didn't change the practical realities. "But perception matters in business, and right now the perception is that employing you puts my store at risk. I'm sorry, Elena, but I have to let you go." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting them. 6 years of reliable employment, of building trust and proving her worth, had been erased by one man's accusation and a newspaper article that reduced her entire existence to a political talking point. "When?" Elena asked quietly. "Today," Mrs. Patterson said, avoiding eye contact. "I'll pay you through the end of the week, and I'll provide a reference letter if you need one, though I'm not sure how much good it will do under the circumstances." Eleanor gathered her few personal belongings from behind the counter, a spare sweater, a small cactus plant she had been nurturing for 3 years, and the adult education program letter that had started to represent hope for a different future. As she prepared to leave, the store's bell chimed and Sheriff Mitchell entered. His eyes immediately took in the scene. Elena's belongings in a small bag, Mrs. Patterson's guilty expression, and the newspaper spread across the counter. His jaw tightened as he read the headline. "Elena," he said gently, "are you all right?" "I've been let go," Elena replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the turmoil inside her chest. Sheriff Mitchell turned to Mrs. Patterson, his expression carefully controlled, but carrying an edge of disappointment. "Margaret, Eleanor has been one of your most reliable employees for years. You're really going to let Harold Brennan's inflammatory journalism dictate your business decisions?" Mrs. Patterson bristled at the implied criticism. "James, you know I respect you, but this isn't just about the newspaper. Federal agents have been in my store twice asking questions about her. That's not the kind of attention any business can afford." "And what happens when they come asking questions about the next person?" Sheriff Mitchell asked. "When do we stop letting fear make our decisions for us?" Elena watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Sheriff Mitchell was once again trying to protect her, but she could see that his influence had limits. Mrs. Patterson's fear was real, and in a small town where reputation could make or break a business, that fear often outweighed personal loyalty. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Mrs. Patterson," Elena said, stepping between the two of them. "I understand your position and I don't blame you for it." Mrs. Patterson looked surprised by Elena's grace in the face of dismissal. "Elena, I really am sorry. You're a good person, and this isn't fair." "Fair or not, it's reality," Elena replied, shouldering her bag. "Thank you for giving me a chance when I needed it." As Elena walked toward the door, Sheriff Mitchell fell into step beside her. "Elena, wait, let me drive you home." Outside, the gray clouds had grown darker, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Eleanor accepted Sheriff Mitchell's offer, grateful for a few moments to process what had just happened, before facing her parents with the news that their family's primary source of income had just disappeared. "I'm sorry," Sheriff Mitchell said, as they drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook. "I should have seen this coming, should have prepared you better for the backlash." Elena turned to look at him, studying his profile as he navigated the familiar roads. "This isn't your fault. You've done more for my family than anyone else in this town ever has." "It's not enough," he said, his voice carrying a frustration that Elena had never heard before. "I became sheriff because I believed I could make a difference, could protect people who needed protection. But when it really mattered, I couldn't stop this from happening to you." "You couldn't stop Mrs. Patterson from making a business decision," Elena said, "but you've given me something more important than a job." Sheriff Mitchell glanced at her questioningly. "You've given me the belief that I'm worth defending," Elena continued. "Before you started treating me like I mattered, I accepted whatever happened to me because I thought that was my place in the world. But now I know I deserve better, and that knowledge is going to matter more in the long run than any job ever could." They pulled up in front of Elena's small house, where the sound of rain on the roof was growing steadier. Sheriff Mitchell turned off the engine but made no move to leave. "Eleanor, I want you to know that this isn't over. Harold Brennan's article was deliberately inflammatory, designed to stir up anti-immigrant sentiment. Danny Morrison has his own legal troubles, and his credibility as a witness is questionable at best. Agent Carson is fishing, hoping to pressure you into making statements that might implicate your family." Eleanor felt a spark of the courage that had been growing inside her over the past weeks. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you have options," Sheriff Mitchell replied. "That adult education program isn't just about getting credentials. It's about building a network of people who will support you, teachers and counselors who understand your potential. There are legal aid organizations that specialize in immigration cases, lawyers who work with families in situations like yours." Elena thought about the letter in her bag, about the classes that started in 3 weeks. Losing her job felt like a door slamming shut, but maybe Sheriff Mitchell was right. Maybe it was also an opportunity to walk through a different door, one that led toward something better than just surviving day to day. "What if I fail?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been her constant companion. "What if you don't?" Sheriff Mitchell replied, echoing his words from their conversation at the store. "Elena, I've seen you handle pressure that would break other people. I've watched you stand up for yourself against federal agents when you had every reason to be terrified. You're stronger than you know." As Elena prepared to get out of the car, Sheriff Mitchell reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "This is Maria Santos," he said, handing it to her. "She's an immigration lawyer in Austin who specializes in cases like yours. I took the liberty of calling her office this morning after I saw the newspaper. She's expecting to hear from you." Eleanor stared at the card, feeling the weight of possibility in her hands. "I don't know how I could ever afford—" "She works with a legal aid organization that provides services on a sliding scale," Sheriff Mitchell interrupted gently. "The consultation is free and they have payment plans for families without much income. The important thing is getting proper legal advice so you know exactly where you stand." Elena tucked the card carefully into her wallet next to the adult education program letter. Two pieces of paper that represented two different paths toward a future she had never imagined possible. "Sheriff," she said as she opened the car door, "why are you doing all this for me? Why do you care what happens to my family?" Sheriff Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the windshield. "Because I became a law enforcement officer to serve and protect all the people in this county, not just the ones who were born here. Because I believe that everyone deserves the chance to build a better life for themselves and their families. And because when I look at you, Elena, I see someone with the intelligence and courage to achieve extraordinary things if given the opportunity." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude for being seen so clearly by someone whose opinion mattered. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying more meaning than any she had ever spoken. As she ran through the rain toward her front door, Eleanor realized that losing her job at the general store might be the beginning of something rather than the end. For the first time in her life, she was going to stop bowing her head and start standing tall, regardless of who might be watching. 3 weeks after losing her job at the general store, Eleanor sat in the parking lot of Millbrook County Adult Education Center, watching other students file into the building for the first night of classes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of her father's old pickup truck, the same one Sheriff Mitchell had helped repair that day that seemed like a lifetime ago. The September evening air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the fluorescent light spilling from the building's windows created rectangles of possibility against the darkening sky. The consultation with Maria Santos had gone better than Eleanor had dared to hope. The immigration lawyer had reviewed her family's situation with professional thoroughness and genuine compassion, explaining that while their legal status remained complicated, there were potential pathways to documentation that Elena had never known existed. More importantly, Maria had emphasized that pursuing education and building community ties would strengthen any future applications for legal residency. "Elena, mija, you've been sitting here for 10 minutes. Her father's voice came through the phone she had forgotten she was holding. Miguel had insisted on being her first phone call when she felt nervous, a role reversal that still felt strange, but comforting. "The worst thing that can happen is you learn something new." Eleanor smiled, despite her nerves. "What if I don't belong there, Papa? What if I'm not smart enough?" "Elena Maria Martinez," her father said, using her full name with the same gentle authority he had employed throughout her childhood. "You balanced the books for 3 different contractors while helping me with my mechanic work, and you ran that store better than the woman who owned it. If you're not smart enough, then smart doesn't mean what I think it means." Taking a deep breath, Elena gathered her notebook and the manila folder containing her enrollment paperwork. The Adult Education Center occupied a converted elementary school building, its hallways still decorated with faded motivational posters and displays of children's artwork that previous tenants had left behind. The juxtaposition felt appropriate, a place where adults came to reclaim educational opportunities they had missed or never had the chance to pursue. Elena's first class was Introduction to Business Administration, taught by Professor Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 40s whose warm smile and efficient demeanor immediately put the diverse group of students at ease. The classroom contained 12 desks arranged in a horseshoe pattern, occupied by people ranging from Elena's age to their 60s, each carrying their own story of why they had chosen to pursue education later in life. "Welcome to what I hope will be a transformative experience for all of you," Professor Chen began, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from years of helping non-traditional students achieve their goals. "Before we dive into course material, I'd like each of you to introduce yourself and share one goal you hope to accomplish through this program." Elena's stomach tightened as the introductions moved around the room. Her classmates included Robert, a recently divorced man in his 50s looking to change careers, Patricia, a mother of 3 who had dropped out of high school to care for her siblings, and Marcus, a veteran using his GI benefits to prepare for college. Each story carried its own weight of deferred dreams and second chances. When Elena's turn arrived, she stood slowly, acutely aware of every eye in the room focused on her. "My name is Elena Martinez," she began, her voice quieter than she intended. "I graduated from high school, but I've been working in retail for the past 6 years. I want to learn business skills so I can have more options for my future." Professor Chen nodded encouragingly. "That's an excellent goal, Elena. Building options for yourself is one of the most empowering things you can do. What kind of business interests you most?" Elena hesitated, then thought about Sheriff Mitchell's words about not letting anyone convince her she wasn't brave enough for whatever came next. "I think I'd like to start my own business someday," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Maybe something that helps other people in situations like mine." The class murmured approvingly, and Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in weeks, she was in a room where her ambitions were met with encouragement rather than skepticism. The 2-hour class passed quickly, covering basic business concepts and organizational structures. Elena found herself taking detailed notes, asking questions, and participating in discussions with growing confidence. When Professor Chen assigned their first project, developing a business plan for a hypothetical company, Elena felt excitement rather than anxiety. As students began filing out of the classroom, Professor Chen approached Elena's desk. "Elena, could I speak with you for a moment?" Elena's old reflexes kicked in, and she immediately began cataloging potential problems. Had she said something wrong? Asked too many questions? Failed to understand something basic that everyone else had grasped immediately? "I wanted to tell you that you have excellent instincts for business analysis," Professor Chen said, her tone warm and professional. "Your questions tonight showed real critical thinking skills. Have you considered pursuing college courses once you complete this certificate program?" Elena blinked in surprise. College had always seemed like something meant for other people, those with clearer paths and more secure futures. I hadn't really thought about it," she admitted. "Well, I think you should," Professor Chen replied. "There are several universities in Texas that have excellent programs for non-traditional students, and many offer significant financial aid. If you're interested, I'd be happy to help you research options." Walking to her father's truck after class, Elena felt lighter than she had in weeks. The conversation with Professor Chen had planted a seed of possibility that felt both terrifying and thrilling. College. The word rolled around in her mind like a marble in a jar, unfamiliar but increasingly appealing. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Elena, this is Sheriff Mitchell. Hope your first class went well. Coffee tomorrow to hear how it went?" James Elena stared at the message, surprised by the informal tone and the use of his first name. Over the months of their acquaintance, he had remained Sheriff Mitchell in all their interactions, a title that maintained professional distance even as their conversations had become more personal. The invitation to coffee felt like a new level of friendship, and Elena found herself looking forward to sharing her evening's experiences with someone who had believed in her potential before she believed in it herself. The next afternoon, Elena met Sheriff Mitchell at Rosie's Diner, a local institution known for its strong coffee and generous slices of pie. The lunch crowd had cleared out, leaving the restaurant quiet enough for private conversation. Elena chose a corner booth, still instinctively preferring seats that didn't put her back to the room. "So," Sheriff Mitchell said, settling into the booth across from her, "how was your first night as a college student?" "It was amazing," Elena replied, then caught herself. "I mean, it was good. Better than I expected." Sheriff Mitchell smiled at her correction. "Elena, you're allowed to be excited about good things happening in your life. You don't have to downplay your achievements to make other people comfortable." Elena considered this, realizing that minimizing her own experiences had become such an ingrained habit that she did it automatically, even in conversations with people who genuinely wanted to celebrate her successes. "It was amazing," she repeated, this time with conviction. "My professor thinks I should consider pursuing college courses after I complete the certificate program. She said I have good analytical instincts." "Professor Chen is right," Sheriff Mitchell said, "and I'm not surprised she recognized your potential so quickly. You've been analyzing complex situations and solving problems for years. You just haven't been in environments where those skills were acknowledged or valued." Elena thought about the 6 years she had spent at the general store, the countless small decisions and problem-solving moments that had seemed routine at the time, but now appeared in a different light. She had been developing business skills without realizing it, learning to manage inventory, handle difficult customers, and maintain accurate financial records. "James," she said, testing out his first name, "can I ask you something?" He nodded encouragingly. "Why did you become a sheriff? I mean, what made you want to go into law enforcement?" Sheriff Mitchell was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I grew up in a town not much different from Millbrook," he said finally. "Small, insular, resistant to change. My father was the police chief, and I watched him use his authority to maintain the status quo rather than to help people. When I became old enough to understand what justice really meant, I realized I wanted to do the job differently." Eleanor listened intently, understanding that he was sharing something personal and important. "I wanted to be the kind of law enforcement officer who protected people rather than just enforcing rules," he continued. "Someone who understood that real safety comes from building trust within communities, not from creating fear or division." "Is that why you helped my family?" Eleanor asked. "I helped your family because it was the right thing to do," he replied simply, "but also because I believe that everyone deserves the chance to pursue their dreams without having to live in fear. Your family has been part of this community for over 20 years. You've contributed, you've worked hard, you've been good neighbors and citizens in every way that matters." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound experience of being truly seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered to her. "Eleanor," Sheriff Mitchell said gently, "I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that you won't let anyone convince you to make yourself smaller to accommodate their discomfort. You have as much right to take up space in this world, to pursue your ambitions, to speak your mind as anyone else." Eleanor looked across the table at this man who had spent months teaching her to see herself differently, who had used his position and influence to protect her family, who had opened doors she hadn't even known existed. The scared young woman who had swept the general store's porch that first morning was still part of her, but she was no longer the whole story. "I promise," Eleanor said, her voice strong and clear. "And James, thank you for showing me that I was worth the effort." As they prepared to leave the diner, Elena realized that she was no longer the same person who had been raised to bow and never speak. She was becoming someone who could stand tall, speak her mind, and pursue her dreams with the confidence that came from knowing she had allies, skills, and most importantly, an unshakable belief in her own worth. 6 months later, the spring air in Millbrook carried the scent of blooming mesquite and the promise of new beginnings. Eleanor stood before the bathroom mirror in her small house, adjusting the collar of her best blouse and smoothing down her hair. Today marked the completion of her business administration certificate program, but more importantly, it was the day she would present her final project to a panel that included local business leaders, Professor Chen, and several community members who had volunteered their time to evaluate student presentations. Her business plan, developed over months of research and refinement, outlined a proposal for a community resource center that would provide translation services, basic legal guidance, and small business mentorship for immigrant families in Millbrook and surrounding counties. The idea had grown from her own experiences navigating systems that seemed designed to exclude people like her family, and from countless conversations with other immigrants who struggled with language barriers and bureaucratic complexities. "Mija, you look beautiful," her mother Carmen said, appearing in the doorway with a cup of coffee and tears of pride in her eyes. "Your father and I are so proud of what you've accomplished." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands slightly unsteady with nerves and excitement. "What if they don't think the idea is good enough? What if they ask questions I can't answer?" Carmen placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Eleanor, for 6 months you have come home from classes talking about market analysis and demographic studies and business models. You know more about this than anyone in that room. Trust yourself." The drive to the adult education center felt different today. Instead of the anxious uncertainty that had characterized her first night of classes, Elena felt a quiet confidence that had been built through months of hard work, challenging discussions, and the gradual realization that she belonged in academic settings just as much as anyone else. The presentation room was fuller than Elena had expected. In addition to the official panel members, she spotted several familiar faces in the audience. Her parents sitting in the front row, Professor Chen offering an encouraging smile, and in the back corner, Sheriff Mitchell, James, who had somehow managed to attend despite his busy schedule. But it was another face that surprised her most. Mrs. Patterson sat in the third row, looking somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably present. Their eyes met briefly, and Elena saw something that might have been regret mixed with curiosity in her former employer's expression. "Good morning, everyone," Elena began, her voice carrying across the room with a clarity that would have astonished the young woman who had once whispered responses to avoid drawing attention. "My name is Elena Martinez, and I'm here to present my business plan for the Millbrook Community Resource Center." Elena clicked to her first slide, which displayed demographic data about the immigrant population in their county. Millbrook County is home to approximately 3,200 residents who were born outside the United States, representing 18% of our total population. These community members contribute significantly to our local economy through their labor, their businesses, and their tax contributions. However, many face barriers that prevent them from fully participating in economic and civic life. She moved through her presentation with growing confidence, outlining the services her proposed center would provide, the potential funding sources she had researched, and the economic benefits that would accrue to the entire community. Elena had spent weeks developing partnerships with existing organizations, researching grant opportunities, and conducting surveys to document the actual needs of immigrant families. The center would not operate as a charity, Elena explained, addressing one of the concerns she anticipated from the panel. Instead, it would function as a sustainable business that provides valuable services while creating jobs and generating revenue. Our research indicates that successful translation and consulting services in similar communities generate annual revenues between $150,000 and $300,000. During the question and answer session, Eleanor fielded inquiries about everything from liability insurance to staff qualifications to long-term sustainability. Each question was answered with the kind of detailed preparation that demonstrated not just academic learning, but a genuine understanding of how to transform an idea into reality. "Miss Martinez," said Dr. William Hayes, a local bank president who served on the evaluation panel, "your research is impressive, but I'm curious about your personal qualifications to manage such an operation. What experience do you have in business management?" Elena felt a familiar flutter of the old insecurity, the voice that whispered she wasn't qualified, wasn't ready, wasn't enough. But then she remembered James's words about not making herself smaller to accommodate others' discomfort. "Dr. Hayes, for 6 years I managed inventory, finances, and customer relations for Patterson's General Store," Elena replied, her voice steady and professional. "I maintained accurate books, handled difficult situations, and consistently met sales targets. More recently, I've completed coursework in business administration, accounting, and non-profit management. But beyond formal qualifications, I bring something equally valuable. I understand the challenges faced by the community this center would serve because I've lived those challenges myself." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly, and Elena noticed several panel members exchanging glances that suggested her answer had been well received. After the presentations concluded, Elena mingled with audience members and panel participants, accepting congratulations and engaging in conversations about next steps for her project. Professor Chen approached with a wide smile and an envelope in her hands. "Elena, I wanted to be the first to tell you that you've been accepted into the University of Texas Business Program," she said, handing over the acceptance letter. "They're offering you a partial scholarship based on your academic performance and your community leadership potential." Elena stared at the letter, the words blurring slightly as tears of joy filled her eyes. College, real college, was no longer a distant dream but an immediate possibility. "There's more," Professor Chen continued. "Dr. Hayes was impressed enough by your presentation that he wants to schedule a meeting about potential startup funding for your resource center. He thinks it could be exactly the kind of community investment his bank should be supporting." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the sudden convergence of opportunities that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say yes," Professor Chen replied with a laugh. "Say yes to all of it." As the crowd began to disperse, Elena found herself face to face with Mrs. Patterson, who had been waiting patiently to speak with her. "Elena," her former employer began, "I owe you an apology. I let fear make my decisions and I treated you unfairly. Watching your presentation today, I realize I lost a valuable employee because I was more worried about what people might think than about doing what was right." Elena studied Mrs. Patterson's face, seeing genuine remorse in her expression. "I appreciate you saying that," Elena replied carefully. "I learned a lot working for you and I'm grateful for the experience. If you ever need a reference for anything, business loans, graduate school applications, whatever, please don't hesitate to ask," Mrs. Patterson said. "You're going to do amazing things, Elena. I should have recognized that sooner." As Mrs. Patterson walked away, Elena felt a sense of closure that she hadn't realized she needed. The woman who had fired her out of fear was now acknowledging her potential, but Elena no longer needed that validation to believe in herself. James approached as the room continued to empty, his face glowing with pride. "Elena, that was extraordinary. You commanded that room like you belonged there." "I did belong there," Elena replied, the truth of that statement settling into her bones with surprising ease. "Yes, you did," James agreed. "And you belong in college classrooms, in boardrooms, in any space where intelligent, capable people gather to solve problems and build better communities." Eleanor looked around the nearly empty room, thinking about how much had changed since that first morning when she had swept the general store's porch, invisible and silent. The young woman who had been raised to bow and never speak had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. "James," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest." He nodded, his expression serious. "That first day when you complimented my work on the porch, was that planned? Were you already thinking about trying to help me change my life?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Honestly, no. That first day I just saw someone who was working hard and taking pride in their work, and I thought that deserved acknowledgement. But Elena, everything that happened after that, your courage, your determination, your success, that was all you. I might have opened a door, but you're the one who walked through it." Elena felt the truth of his words resonate in her chest. She had walked through the door, and not just walked. She had run, had leapt, had soared in directions she had never imagined possible. "What happens now?" James asked. Elena looked at the acceptance letter in her hands, thought about the bank meeting Dr. Hayes wanted to schedule, considered the community resource center that could become reality within a year. "Now I keep standing tall," she said. "Now I use my voice to help other people find theirs." As they walked out of the building together, Eleanor realized that her story was no longer about a young woman who had been raised to bow and never speak. It was about someone who had learned that standing tall wasn't just about personal dignity. It was about creating space for others to stand tall too. The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and Elena thought about all the mornings she had swept that porch, head down, invisible by design. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for college. Next month, she would meet with bank officials about funding her business idea. Next year, she would be helping other immigrant families navigate systems that had once seemed insurmountable. Elena Martinez was no longer raising herself to bow. She was raising herself to soar.